There are three ways of looking what the next few years are going to look like in Central Europe, both economically and politically. And I think it's driven by the three major influences that are affecting the region. So I think obviously today is a very important day in the United States. We have the change of administration. Joe Biden is coming in as a president. And that in itself, I think, signals a very major factor that the global economy is going to have to take account of. Biden has come in already promising a very strong recovery package. About $1.9 trillion are going to be coming in, front-loaded. And if you take all the post-COVID stimulus packages that have come in, if you add the Biden package to the Trump package, it's over $5 trillion overall, which represents about 25% of US GDP if you accumulate it. So that's going to be a massive boost to the US economy. We're going to see about 4% growth. So I think a lot of the if you look at the global economy and how Central Europe it benefits from that stimulus package in itself is going to have a very salutary effect on the global economy. And there will obviously be major trickle-down effects into both the EU and Central Europe. And a lot of people have been wondering how the Central European-US relationship is going to be impacted by the Biden presidency. Obviously, under Trump, we saw a very strong bilateralization of US policy, particularly in the region. Very strong relationship with Poland, very strong relationship with Hungary and one or two other countries, and really a defocusing of the Trump administration away from Brussels, Germany, and France in favor of Central Europe. There were a number of deals done, both in defense, major energy initiatives, technology dialogue, infrastructure, and so on. Now, that may shift very slightly for three major reasons. I mean, first of all, Biden, of course, has already stated very clearly that his ambition is to recover the relationship with the EU, Berlin and Paris especially, a return to multilateralism, in other words, moving away from the bilateralization of policy and focusing very much on relationships with institutions such as the EU. That's point number one. Secondly, on NATO also, I think we're going to see a refocusing on the relationship with the NATO with the institution of NATO itself, a re-legitimization of NATO as well, and again moving away from some of the bilateral defense relationships that we've seen. Not moving away, but really rebalancing in favor of a more holistic approach to NATO. And of course, bear in mind that already we've seen senior figures in the incoming Biden administration prior to today in their writings and their public commentary being very critical of countries like Poland and Hungary, focusing on rule of law issues and so on. And there's been a suspicion, certainly a concern, both in Budapest and Warsaw, that this may lead to a sort of a cooling of the bilateral relationship with the US. Now, all those factors, I think, will come into play. But overall, as you look at it, ultimately, Poland especially is a frontline NATO state. There are substantial commercial US interests here. I've mentioned defense, there's energy, there's the digital dialogue. And of course, there's some, a desire to work closely together on COVID. So I think overall, the strategic impact on Central Europe will be slight. But on terms of bilateral relationships, I think you may see a slight cooling with the US. So that's the US. What about the EU? How is that going to shift now in the grand order? Well, again, refocusing on the economy. Now, I spoke about the very strong Biden stimulus package. Now, of course, the EU has also had a COVID recovery plan that's 750 billion euro, as we know. But there are significant weaknesses in this compared with what the US is doing. The US is really front-loading a lot of this money. The EU, in contrast, is actually going to spread this largesse, as it were, relative largesse, over 27 member states. It's stretched out into 2026. A substantial part of that package is actually loans rather than grants. So that actually may actually increase the fiscal burden to some extent on sort of the countries that take it up, and it's something that actually some countries, particularly on the loan side, may quaver on, because there is a sense that there may be political linkages to policy. So overall, the structural relief program of the EU is nowhere near the strength of the US recovery fund. And of course, even as Europe does emerge from COVID, and we are going to be seeing, I think there's a prediction about 3 to 4% GDP growth overall over the next year, that may be imbalanced between the north and the south. Countries such as Portugal, Greece, Italy, I think will be much slower to recover than the broader EU 27 in relative terms. Central Europe itself, overall, as we've seen over the last decade, there are substantial productivity, infrastructure and supply chain reserves in this part of the world. So even if this EU stimulus package is not as strong as the US package, I think Central Europe still has the potential to certainly make up some of that slack relatively more quickly than some of the other countries. And Poland, especially, I think, is in a very good position. It's had the lowest relative GDP fall in 2020. Sorry, it's forecast a growth in this year. So I think it's already on an upward trajectory. And the COVID impact, I think, has not been as strong as it has been in some other EU countries. So there is some good news economically in Poland, but I think in general terms, the EU is not going to do as well in terms of recovery as the US will. Now, of course, and of course, the Brexit impact, I think, is also worth mentioning, because I think we're already seeing the prospect in the UK in terms of its vaccination program moving way ahead of the EU, the remaining EU countries. And that will give the UK, I think, a significant growth advantage in the second half of the year. Assuming things go according to plan, we'll see the UK opening up much more quickly than Europe. And I think you will see an increasing divergence of growth between the UK and the EU as a whole. So that's certainly something to watch there. As far as the relationship between, the impact of all this on the relationship between Central Europe and the European Union, particularly Brussels, is concerned, I think there's several things to watch out for here. Again, as I was saying earlier in the relationship with Trump, some countries such as Poland and Hungary hitched themselves very much to the Trump bandwagon. That's been noted in Brussels. I don't think that's helpful to either Poland or Hungary going forward, particularly since there are these continual rule of law mechanisms and issues over media freedom, NGO rights, cultural issues. I think these are always going to be in the background of the relationship going forward. And we'll see over the next 2 years how the rule of law mechanism, which was injected into the multi-year financing framework of the next 7 years, is going to impact the region. There may be some activity by Brussels in relation to Poland and Hungary if they're judged to be breaking rule of law, and that may affect some of the fiscal chances that we usually see. Of course, the big question is what's going to happen in Germany post-Merkel. That's really a question for 2022, of course. And we'll see who the chancellor is. It may or may not be Armin Laschet, who was elected as the new head of the CDU. But Germany has been a crucial player in terms of bridging some of the controversies between Brussels and Central Europe. Merkel has consistently played a mediating role, particularly in relation to Hungary and Poland. And we'll see if that policy continues. If it doesn't, there may be more political issues between the region and Brussels as a whole. Macron is a big unknown. He's facing elections next year, as we know, and that may also impact on his attitude towards issues such as rule of law in the region. And finally, of course, for Central Europe, the departure of the UK is going to have a significant impact, because the UK, on many issues, not just international policy relationships with the US, but on economic policies, particularly on issues of market liberalization, was always going to be an ally of the region. Now, I'll skip through this slide very quickly, because it really touches on some of the deeper issues which are going to impact the broader EU-US relationship. And the three really to look out for, I think, are NATO, Russia, and China. Biden has come in with a very open desire to build up a new, deeper relationship with Europe. But on a lot of these issues, despite the positive rhetoric there's actually some still contention, which I think we'll see emerging over the next few months. On NATO, there will be this continued issue on whether or not Europe can increase its defense spending in terms of GDP, as is suspected the US will pivot more towards looking at the China challenge. On Russia, again, I think there's a potential dispute ahead. On the one hand, a very strong and, well, Russo-skeptic policy, if I can put it that way, by Biden, in contrast to Trump. But Germany, I think, particularly under Laschet, with the CDU, is going to be looking for a much more stable relationship with Russia, more of a modus vivendi. That may cause some tensions. And of course, on China, that's a really big potential driver of dispute between Europe and the US. The US looks as if it's going to continue, broadly speaking, the Trumpian skepticism towards Beijing. But a number of EU countries, particularly Germany, we've seen the new EU-China investment agreement, obviously perhaps slightly trying to temper that approach. There's a lot of issues out there which, despite the optimism of the Biden coming in, will this create a new relationship with Europe? There are a number of issues which are going to be driving conflict. Now, on the final, so just to sort of close off a little bit, this is one of my favorite topics, is the 3 Cs initiative. Because I think, despite everything that we've been saying, and I think there are certainly Central Europe has been looking towards a mechanism by which it can, as it were, make up some of the significant infrastructure gaps which exist between the region as a whole. The 3 Cs, as you well know, is the swathe of 11 or 12 countries from the Baltics to the Balkans. It's an informal relationship, but it's been designed to create all sorts of institutional mechanisms for investing in energy, in digital, and especially infrastructure, and looking for mechanisms to pump prime a number of significant regional investment projects, given that, of course, there are continue to be fiscal and monetary constraints by the Central European governments on growth, but creating a 3 Cs investment fund, which is looking for support, not just from indigenous funding, but there's also some US investment coming in. They're looking for other sources of funding globally. So I think this is a mechanism which I think, again, given what I was saying earlier about the potential for growth in the region, is going to be very, very helpful. And insofar as that affects infrastructure, that, of course, will have very significant impacts on employment and growth in particular countries. So I think it's very difficult over 10 minutes just to give a much more detail. But I think as the Biden presidency comes in, we'll see a new dynamic in the relationship with the EU. And also there will be a new dynamic within the EU, Brexit aside, between the region and Brussels. And that will really be driven by what happens in France and Germany over the next year. But broadly speaking, Central Europe coming out of COVID has got significant growth advantages. Whether that's carried on in the longer term, it remains to be seen. But the next 2 years, I think, will show some renewed optimism. The one thing that might stymie this is COVID. And there's been a relatively slower rollout in several Central European countries in relation to other Western European countries. If Central Europe does not open up more quickly or roll out the vaccines more quickly, that may be the factor that could sabotage a lot of this optimism. But that remains to be seen over the next 6 months. Thank you very much.